Hello! Today we're going to be painting the Sole Survivor, Dogmeat and Codsworth for Fallout Wasteland Warfare. The Sole Survivor and Dogmeat we're going to be painting and assembling straight out of the box, but we're going to be making a few modifications to Codsworth that I think you'll like. The assembly of the minis is straightforward, but of course they benefit from a little care as most resin minis do. I've given them all a wash and a gentle scrub in some warm water to remove any grease or demoulding agent that might be left over from manufacturing. Any obvious flash or mould lines are then removed by cutting or scraping the blade along the edge of the piece. I check the fit of the pieces, occasionally removing a little more material, then glue them together. Some standard cyanoacrylate, often called superglue or CA glue, is used to glue the pieces together. For Codsworth, I want to swap the opaque flight stand with a clear one and drill out some of the infill on his little claw hand. I also want to add some lenses for his eyes, but that'll be a later step. For the flight stand, I first want to check that the stand I have is going to be able to fit into the scenic base. With a little modification it fits fine, so I just need to pick the right size of drill bit for my pin vise and drill out the base of the flame where the opaque stand used to be. For the claw hand, the infill is there to make casting more reliable and to make that part a little more durable. I think Codsworth would look better without it though, and personally I'm happy to compromise some of the durability to get better detail. After that I used a knife to clean up the edges a little, then clipped off, cleaned up and glued together the rest of the model as before. Of course, without the opaque flight stand, we need a temporary base to hold Codsworth by for painting. I'm just using a paper clip, unfolded and cut to size, to turn this spare slot base into one. There are a few small gaps to fill on the minis. I personally prefer to fill these with Kneadertite, but other people prefer Miller Put, Tamiya Putty, or even baking powder and superglue. For Dogmeat in the Sole Survivor, I used a grey primer out of a rattle can. It's also highlighted a few mould lines that I missed when assembling the minis, so I'm using a sharp knife to remove them, then I'll reprime it. When painting a detailed miniature like this, I normally start with the most recessed or hardest to do details first. That way I can correct any mistakes without worrying about getting paint onto any areas I've already done. In this case, that means starting with the eyes. I'm using a slightly pink off-white for the whites of the eyes, as in real life our eyes aren't a bright pure white. They're typically a little off-white and have small red capillaries going through them that can give a slight pink tinge. Pallid Witch Flesh from Citadel is the specific paint I'm using in this case. Once I've got the whites and the pupils painted, I use black to clean up the edges. The mini is based on one of the default starting character options in Fallout 4, so I'm going to try and base the hair and skin colour on that character. Cadian Flesh Tone from Citadel is the base I'm using in this case for a light skin tone. The Vault Suit is next, as it's covered by lots of armour and pouches. I'm going with Calidor Sky for the base coat, applying it in a couple of layers as needed to build up the opacity. There are different origins for the leather on this mini, so I want to paint them slightly differently to show that. For the original leather cuffs of the Vault Suit, I'm using a rich, warm brown, specifically Rhinox hide. I imagine this to be high quality, nicely made pre-war leather, where the appearance was more important than it would be for the leather armour Nate's made. Although I like to prime miniatures in grey, it's not the easiest undercoat to paint yellow over, so I'm putting a bright white layer down on the zip and vault number before I use the yellow. I've also found Vallejo's deep yellow seems to have better coverage than Citadel's equivalent, but that might just be me. I want the leather armour to look a bit less saturated, less like it's been carefully tinted or dyed, but still similar in overall hue. It's meant to have been made after the bombs fell after all. For this colour I'm using dryad bark, being careful not to get it onto the Vault Suit underneath. There's a lot of little details to pick out with this colour, it's fun. Just in case you're not bored of brown yet, we're now doing the rifle stock. This is a much warmer, almost orange hue though, to match the nicer colour of the wooden stock for the hunting rifle in game. Lastly, a lighter, desaturated brown is used to paint the butt of the stock. A little black is used to pick out the cable on the chest. I want to try painting something onto the screen of the Pip-Boy. I was originally thinking I could try painting the map, but looking at reference photos I'm not sure I could make it particularly recognisable as a map, especially not at this size, so I'm thinking instead of doing the status screen. This will be interesting to try and record as well. Normally when I'm painting super fine details, I like to hold the miniature quite close to my face like this. But if I do that, you won't be able to see the miniature on the camera, you'll just see the back of my head. So, we'll see what I can do. I'm starting by painting the screen itself in black, then outlining the details on it in a bright white. We'll start by painting the menu lines at the top and bottom of the screen, before we try and paint the figure in the middle. This was, as you can probably imagine, rather difficult. I kept painting something and then going back to correct it, only to mess it up and paint over it again. At one point I thought I wasn't actually going to be able to do it within the menu borders, and painted over them. But, after a lot of corrections, I finally managed a version I was happy with. Once I was happy with the figure, I added two small dashes to represent different readouts of active conditions next to them. Before we add the glaze to turn the screen green, we're going to paint the casing of the Pip-Boy. This way we can add a little of the glaze onto the casing to represent glowing if we want to. In this case, since we're doing the Sole Survivor from Fallout 4 and this is sculpted as the 3000 Mark IV Pip-Boy, we're going to paint it with a mix of Steel Legion Drab and Deathworld Forest. If you're wanting to paint it like the versions from Fallout 3 or New Vegas, I'd try something like Castellan Green with a little black mixed into it. The knobs and dials are picked out in a very dark grey, while Wraithbone is used for the adapter plug and rad indicator. Finally, thinned warpstone glow is applied over the screen to tint it green. I'm letting it flow into the edges to suggest light reflecting off the insides of the screen shade. With the Pip-Boy complete, we're almost done with the base coats. The wraps on the rifle stock are picked out with a light grey, while the hair is a very dark grey. Dryad bark and Rhinox hide are used again, though this time for the soil and metal beam respectively. Baneblade brown is my go-to for wooden planks, while I'll pick out the stones in a cool medium grey and the bricks with word bearers red. Lastly, the Nuka-Cola bottle is done in a very dark grey. Oop, almost forgot the pistol grip. I'll pick this out with cat can flash. I found I prefer Vallejo's metallics to Citadel's personally. The pistol and rifle details are done in gunmetal, and natural steel is used for picking out everything else. There's a lot of lovely details here, so take your time and enjoy the process. You can always use the original colour to correct any mistakes. With our base coats applied, we'd often move on to an all-over wash to darken things down a bit and put a bit of shadow into the recesses. In this case though, while I will be putting a wash onto the skin areas, we're actually going to save the all-over wash until much closer to the end. I'm washing the skin with Reichland Flesh Shade, then re-establishing the base coat with Cadian Flesh. The wash has also helped highlight exactly where the eyebrows are on the Mini, so I'm picking them out with the same colour as the hair. Of course, skin in the real world isn't evenly coloured across the whole body. I'm mixing different levels of corn red into Cadian Flesh to add a little colour to the cheeks, nose, lips and around the knuckles and palms of the hand. This doesn't look great yet, but it'll start to look better as we blend it into the surrounding skin using glazes of Cadian Flesh mixed with Kislev Flesh. Pure Kislev Flesh is used for most of the final highlights, with a little pallid witch flesh mixed in for the very brightest spots. To add some volumetric highlights to the Vault suit, we're mixing in a little Techless Blue, increasing the proportion until we're at pure Techless Blue on the brightest areas. When glazing like this, it's helpful to remember to move the brush in the direction of where you want the most paint to be deposited. For the leather armour, we're going to start with a glaze mixed from Cascand Flesh, Mournfang Brown and a tiny amount of Talon Sand, applied as a volumetric highlight. We're then going to add a small number of scratches and do some edge highlighting by mixing in a little more Talon Sand. It's very easy to overdo the scratches when painting armour like this. Personally, I found it's a case of less is more, as too many can give a uniform look that almost appears more like camouflage. When doing the edge highlights, do them in small dags unevenly along the sides of the leather. This helps to sell the look of wear and tear. For the leather cuff and boots, we want to maintain the slightly different hue, so we're going to do volumetric highlights using a mix of Rhinox Hide and Mournfang Brown. A small amount of Talon Sand is added to highlight along the edges. Scrag Brown is used to highlight the rifle stock, while an off-white highlights the wraps. I want to give a suggestion of some grey starting to creep into Nate's hair. He's had a bit of a stressful time of it lately, and I don't know if hair dye is the easiest thing to come by in the Wasteland. There are lots of really nicely sculpted locks and strands of hair on this Mini, so I'm just going to pick them out with gradually lightening shades of grey. I don't want this to be too evenly applied though, or it'll make his normal hair colour look like shading instead, so I'm being more sparing than I otherwise would be. I don't want this to be too evenly applied though, or it'll make his normal hair colour look like shading instead, so I'm being more sparing than I otherwise would be. I do still want a little regular highlighting though, and using the side of the brush is really helpful for this. To paint the glass bottle, I essentially invert the shading that I would normally do. When light hits a transparent object like this, it bounces and refracts inside of it, as well as passing through and reflecting off the surface underneath, essentially making the colour of the item more visible on the lower areas than on the top. The glass itself is glossy though, so I apply tiny spots of bright white to some areas to suggest where light has reflected off the surface instead of passing through. I finish it with a very thin glaze of a desaturated blue, just to tint it slightly. There we are. I think that reads well enough as glass personally, though what do you think of it? Do you ever get to the stage where you'd normally start weathering and find that you're no longer sure you really want to? I often use the weathering stage as a way of covering up anything that I'm not quite happy with in the model. Things like an oil wash or acrylic wash, or some dry brushing of a bit of mud, can do a great job of covering up in areas where the blending perhaps isn't so smooth, or I'm not happy with the shading or highlighting or anything else on it really. But I'm actually really happy with the paint job so far, and I don't want to risk ruining it by putting anything over the top that I'm less happy with. It does need weathering though, at least a little bit. I think I'll dry brush and wash the base as normal, but I'll be a lot more sparing with dirt over the suit itself, using the normal brush rather than a dry brush to apply it carefully. And rather than doing an all over oil wash, I think I'll just apply the oil wash in areas where I want a bit more shading, a bit more contrast to help it pop. And of course a bit of rust on the metal areas. I'm going to paint the rim of the base now before I do the weathering, just so that any washes I apply will be able to flow into the gap between the base rim and the painted details of the base itself. I've heard of people using old makeup brushes for dry brushing, so I've saved one of mine for this occasion. It definitely gives a smoother look than the stiff bristled brushes I usually work with, but I'm not sure if it's what I'm looking for on this occasion. I'm wanting the ground to look a little drier, still with a decent amount of nutrient richness, but like it's a little dusty in the summer heat. The nerve-wracking part is applying this to the suit. I'm using Steel Legion Drab, the same as I did for the base, but instead of dry brushing it, I've thinned it heavily with water. I've deliberately added a little too much actually, so that the paint has started to break, and the pigment is no longer evenly distributed in the medium. I'm then washing this into the recesses, where it dries slightly unevenly as a result. Dry brushing is great for speed of course, but in this case I think washing the paint makes it settle into the recesses and look more like grime that's built up over a while. In some spots I've left it very thin, so it only discolours the blue and doesn't read obviously as brown, while in other areas I've built it up to show a patch of actual dirt in the folds of the suit. I'm mostly applying it to the lower legs, but I'm also applying it in a few other spots over Nate's equipment to suggest where he might have been in a scrap or gotten a bit of dirt on his weapons. For the weapons specifically, I don't want them to look too beaten up. They're likely a significant part of how he's still alive, and I imagine he would maintain them as well as he could with limited resources. I'm still going to use a little Mornfang brown in some recesses though, as well as on the metal beam on the base. My goal here is to paint the Soul Survivor as though they've got a bit of experience under their belt now. They're not quite as hard bitten as some of the denizens as they'll encounter, but I'm imagining that they've got a little base, maybe even gone to Diamond City, done a few quests, that sort of thing. Finally, I'm going to use an oil wash all over the base, and sparingly on the figure. The oil wash is made from a little black and brown oil paint, mixed in with quite a bit of thinner. This is then applied with a brush, and excess removed with another brush that's either still dry or has a little thinner on it. Now I've applied the wash over the base, I'm applying it in certain spots on the miniature. Mostly areas where there are lots of excellent details to pick out, such as the Pip-Boy, but I'm also using it to apply little patches of shading over the vault suit and armour. This helps to add variation, making it feel more natural and a little worn. To finish the miniature and really showcase all of the work we've done, we're going to apply some varnishes over the top. These are usually applied to give a bit of protection to paint jobs before gaming, but some can give different gloss or matte finishes that improve how the model looks. In this case, we're going to use a moderate gloss varnish on the screen of the Pip-Boy and the glass bottle on the base. We'll then be using a very matte finish on everything else, though we will be thinning it with a little paint medium to affect just how matte different surfaces become. This means they will reflect the light in subtly different ways, and it helps to trick our eyes into thinking that they're different materials, even if we really know it's just paint. The exception to this is the metallics. You can use a gloss varnish to make a metal really reflective, but you absolutely don't want to get the matte varnish onto your metallic areas. The reflectance of the metallic particles will disappear, and your paint will just look like the flat colour instead. I should add that wearing a plaster in your thumb is not necessary for this step, though still recommended if your trial by cheese grater ended in a failure like mine did. But where would our hero be without their faithful companion? We can't have Fallout without Dogmeat now, can we? For Dogmeat, we're starting with the same grey primer that we did for our Sole Survivor, and our first layer is Morghast bone on the underside of the body. This took a couple of coats to reach full opacity. The tongue and gums, as well as the ears, are picked out in Fulgrim pink. Checking against references, I'm not sure the initial Morghast bone layer covers enough of Dogmeat's body, so I'm adding a little more around their face and neck. I then started to add the next layer with rat skin flesh, but I'm not happy with how it looks, so before it dries I quickly wash it with water and wipe most of it up, before going back with Morghast bone. Instead I'm mixing a little scrag brown into the Morghast bone. Much better. Drier bark forms the start of the darker areas of fur. I'm glazing and feathering it a little at the edges, using the sculpted fur texture to help blend it with the cream coloured layers. We'll also be using a wash later, which will help to smooth the transitions. Corvus Black is the last main fur colour, and is applied towards the top side of the body, again glazing and feathering it with the layers below. I'm continually checking reference screenshots to try and approximate the fur pattern, though admittedly I'm not getting it perfectly. The nose and pads of the feet are also picked out with Corvus Black. I'm quite happy with how that looks, so I'm going to paint the lenses of the goggles next. Painting reflective surfaces at this size is tricky, but they add so much character to the Mini. Dark Reaper by Citadel is my paint of choice for the basic colour, as it's fairly desaturated but with a hint of blue to suggest reflections of the sky. Similarly to the glass bottle, we're essentially highlighting in the opposite direction to what we would normally do, and glazing Thunderhawk blue towards the bottom left of each lens. A little white is mixed in for the final highlight around the bottom curve, before a tiny dot of pure white is placed in the opposite side. The strap is picked out in Thondia brown, mostly so I'm not just using the same few browns over and over again. For the adorable bandana Dogmeat is wearing, there are a few different variations, but the red hue just feels right somehow. I've mixed some Evil Sun Scarlet with a little squig orange to make it look a little faded, which I'm now layering over the whole bandana in 2 coats. More squig orange is mixed in for a simple highlight before I add the pattern, which I'm doing in rat skin flesh. Admittedly, this doesn't match the actual pattern in game super well, but I'm hoping it'll still give the impression of patterned fabric. It took me a minute to realise, but there's a destroyed synth on the base of Dogmeat. Given it contains a significant amount of metallic components, we'll paint the metallics of the synth at the same time that we do the metallics of the goggles. I'll always do metallic components together where I can, even if they're in different hues, as it avoids the hassle of having to repeatedly rinse out and refill the water pot. No reason more significant than that. The metallic parts of the synth, Dogmeat's goggles, and the upturned bottle caps are all painted with Vallejo's natural steel. The cream parts of the synth's body are then painted with Citadel's wraith bone. Scarsnick green is used to pick out the green sections of the head and robotic components, while I'm using Baharoth blue for the blue components. Lastly, Scrag brown is used for the orangey brown piping. I do love the colour scheme of the synths in Fallout 4, so it's fun getting to replicate it here. Pure Evil Sun Scarlet is used for the Nuka-Cola bottle caps, while white is used to approximate script on top. Alas, I think painting the full Nuka-Cola logo at this scale is probably beyond me. I'm going to paint the soil on this base with Steel Legion drab instead of dry bark. I'm hoping it'll communicate that this is shallow, dry soil blasted up from underneath a damaged road or concrete section. The concrete is painted with a neutral mid-grey, and the base is rimmed with black. Then everything on the base is dry brushed with Steel Legion Drab. We're using the same oil wash as we did for the Soul Survivor, but this time we're applying it all over the model, not just in selected areas. In a few spots I'd add a slightly more concentrated mix of the wash to really bring out the beautiful details of the fur texture. To finish Dogmeat, we're applying varnishes as before. A matte varnish is applied over the base, fur and bandana, being careful again to avoid metallic areas like the synth. A slightly different mix is used for the ground and the fur, with the ground being more matte and the fur being relatively more satin, but still matte overall. A low gloss varnish is applied over the goggles, the mouth, and of course the nose. The last of our trio is of course Codsworth. I think people sometimes look at Codsworth and assume they're the same hue all over, and miss the darker shade of metallic used in the underframe compared to the chrome plates on top. It might not sound like a lot, but I want to make sure I capture that variation, as I think it'll make the miniature more interesting to look at overall. That said, the shiny chrome is still the most immediately recognisable part of Codsworth, so we want to make sure we get that right. I'm starting with a gloss black primer all over Codsworth. For a metallic paint to look its best, the metallic flakes need to lay as smooth and as flat on the surface of the miniature as possible. Gloss black paints typically have very small pigment grain sizes and a very shiny finish, which means they create a very smooth surface for the paints going on top. I'm also trying out using a lacquer based paint for the chrome layer. I've not used lacquer based paints before, mostly because you want to be really careful about breathing in the fumes they produce. They're meant to be great at self-leveling though, and I've heard the solvent allows some pigments that wouldn't work with an acrylic paint. We let it cure for about 24 hours, then start picking out some of the details. I'm using Mephiston Red for the little red canister on the flamethrower, and Corvus Black for the very dark grey piping and mechanical sections. The chrome layer isn't great as a base coat though, and the acrylic doesn't want to adhere to it, so you might need a few layers for this. Vallejo's light yellow is used for the small fuel canister. The centre of the camera lenses is picked out with black, then the iris is picked out in a neutral medium grey. You can see here that the iris for the right hand eye has been mirrored compared to the other two, likely to save time when it was sculpted digitally. You'd probably have to be overthinking things to spot that though. We want the flame to be as bright as possible, so we're undercoating it with a bright white. Basically all paints are slightly translucent when applied in layers as thin as we do on miniatures, so having the bright undercoat will make the layers on top seem a little brighter as well. For the flames themselves, we're starting with Wild Rider Red, and then gradually glazing up through Troll Slayer Orange, Fire Dragon Bright, Vallejo Deep Yellow, and finally Vallejo Light Yellow. You want the more yellow hues to be closer to the top and in the recesses of the flames, while the tips of the flames should be closer to red as the flame cools. You might find it easiest to do this while holding the model upside down, as any paint that's a little thin and still running will flow into the recesses towards the source of the fire. Now we want to pick out the darker metal of the body under the chrome panels. I'm using Vallejo's gunmetal for this, as it's a nice dark metallic colour. The chrome layer works against us here, as our gunmetal doesn't want to adhere to it evenly, but a second coat over these areas helps with that. I'm also happy to deal with a little difficulty on these layers for how shiny the chrome is. Reference images are key here, as they help us to see which parts of the body are the darker underbody and which parts are the chrome panels that General Atomics put on top. Images of the Miss Nanny robot can be helpful here, as the use of white for the panelling makes it easier to see which sections are which. To weather Codsworth, we're going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Thundia Brown and Steel Legion Drab. We're going to paint this rust a little differently though. Specifically, you'll notice that most of the rust I'm applying is in flecks and scratches over the surface, and less in recesses where water has collected. I'm doing this to try and emulate the properties of something that is chrome rather than iron or steel. Now, chromium metal is expensive. Instead of making an item out of solid chromium, it's much more common to apply the chrome as a thin layer over the top of a different metal, such as steel or aluminium. The chromium then passivates itself, forming a microscopic layer of oxide that stops air from corroding the metal underneath. Should the chrome layer be chipped or damaged though, then the metal underneath is exposed, and rust can start to form. Thus the rust on a chrome surface normally appears as small dots or scratches where the chrome layer has been damaged, instead of forming in recesses like it does on steel. I am still applying a few streaks and patches and recesses though, as we're not just painting rust on the surface, but dirt and grime built up over 200 years of wasteland living. Finally, a black oil wash is applied over the whole Mini, with excess being wiped off with some thinner. A downside to the shininess of the chrome finish is that it can make it harder to see some of the gorgeous details on this Mini, so the wash really helps them to stand out. Okay, that's not quite it. Do you remember when I mentioned the eye lenses earlier? Well, we're going to try and use some gloss varnish for these. This took something like 7 or 8 layers to smooth over the irises underneath, but once the surface is smooth, I think it does a great job of looking like glass lenses. To paint the base, we're starting with our usual grey primer. A neutral medium grey, in this case Dawnstone from Citadel, is used for the concrete sections, while Steel Legion Drab is for the dry soil. I do wonder why the Commonwealth seems so dry at times. There's very little moss or lichen, especially given the time frame. Although maybe that's just because I live in the UK, where we get enough rain that moss will grow on basically any surface in a couple of years if you don't power wash it regularly. Anyway, after that, we're painting the wooden plank with the same desaturated hue we used on other planks, Baneblade Brown. The upright facing bottle caps are picked out with Mephiston Red, and Word Bearer's Red is used for the bricks. I'm painting the bottles as before, starting with a very dark grey, then glazing highlights with increasingly light greys. Remember to put most of the brighter highlights on the lower regions to show light passing through and reflecting within the glass. A tiny amount of bright white is used to dot and edge highlight where the light initially hits the bottle. I started to paint the bottle of Mr. Handy Fuel with a 4:1 mix of Ushabti Bone and Fire Dragon Bright, but then realised I'd forgotten to hollow out the handles. These are cast filled in for the sake of reliability, but I think it's worth a few moments work with a knife to cut them out compared to painting them black. Alas, you can see my hubris got the better of me when doing the same with the handle on top of the bottle, but fortunately this is easily repaired with a dab of superglue. Mephiston Red is used for the cap and valve. A quick dry brush of Steel Legion Drab helps to dirty things up a little, before we paint the upturned bottle caps with Vallejo's natural steel. I'm also using this to add a few scratches to the fuel bottle. I almost forgot to paint the script on the bottle caps. It wouldn't have been the end of the world, but I did it for the bottle caps on the other models, so I want to be consistent. I can't help but feel the label for the Mr. Handy Fuel bottle is also looking a little bare. I'm not the best when it comes to cursive, but I'm going to have a go at freehand painting the visible part of the label, which is mostly just writing the Mr. part of the name. There we are, I'm very pleased with that. A mix of black and brown oil paint is applied as a wash over the whole base, though it's a little thick in this case. One of the upsides of oil paints is how easy it is to remove them if you make a mistake though, and in this case I'm just using a paper towel to dab up the worst of the excess, followed by a brush with a little thinner to remove and soak up the rest. Then it's just the final varnishes to tone down the shine from the paint. The clear flight stem fits into place fairly well, but has a few gaps around the edge. I'm just filling these with superglue though, then touching up the paintwork with a glaze of Baneblade Brown and a matte varnish. Now all that's left is to attach Codsworth and we can move on to the beauty shots. I'm really pleased with these miniatures. They were so much fun to paint, and they've got so many details on them. I think I could have done a slightly better job painting the Soul Survivor's eyes, getting the shape a little bit better on that, but I'm really happy with how the Pip-Boy came out. I really like the chrome effect on Codsworth, and Dogmeat just looks adorable. Yeah, very happy with these. Thank you so much for watching this video though. Look after each other, and I'll see you next time.